Heather, thanks for. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Travis Hoffman. I serve as our NDSU and University of Minnesota Extension Sheep and Goat Extension Specialist. And I am excited that you have joined us this evening for our Managing Buckthorn webinar. I'd like to give the quick shout out to Sabrina Florentino for helping us to coordinate this event that's co-sponsored by our Sustainable Farming Association and helping us out with that. We have a talented group of individuals that are helping us this evening, and I'm going to allow Sabrina to take the floor as our moderator this evening, as we are in the University of Minnesota, driven to discover, and at NDSU, extending knowledge and changing lives. Sabrina, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you, Travis. As Travis mentioned, I'm Sabrina Florentino, the Alternative Livestock Systems Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota. And we are excited to bring to you three different researchers from the University of Minnesota who are here to share their strategies for buckthorn control with and without goats. And we're excited that we can offer this in conjunction with the Sustainable Farming Association's field days they will be having later this summer. But without further ado, I think we will introduce our speakers, and we will have each of them present and then save questions for the end. Anything else to add, Travis?
Charge on.
Perfect. So our first presenter is Sarah Nelson, and she is a natural resource specialist with the Dakota County Parks, where she currently manages several goat browsing projects. She earned her master's in conservation sciences from the University of Minnesota, and her research focused on the effectiveness of prescribed goat browsing and other strategies for restoring sites invaded by buckthorn. Followed by Sarah, we will have Dr. Tiffany Wolf, who is an assistant professor of ecosystem health at the College of Veterinary Medicine and the co-director of the Minnesota Center for Prion Research and Outreach at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Wolf is a wildlife epidemiologist and veterinarian who works closely with natural resource managers and community partners to understand wildlife disease patterns. Dr. Wolf received her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from Louisiana State University in 2002 and her PhD from the University of Minnesota in 2015. And she will share her research findings on grazing goats for buckthorn control and the risk of exposure to brainworm, a deadly parasite found in white-tailed deer. And then finally, we'll have Dr. Mike Schuster, who is a researcher in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota and a member of the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center. His research focuses on the process of exotic plant invasions and their consequences for ecosystem functioning. And since 2016, Mike and his collaborators have led the Cover It Up project, which includes a series of experiments designed to evaluate new ways of preventing buckthorn from returning in the years following buckthorn management, for example, including a dense cover of native plants. So we will cover the various processes related to buckthorn management with these three, and then are excited to hear your questions. So we can have Sarah take it away.
Let's see here. Screen. Okay, I'm gonna try to get to the beginning of my slideshow here. Okay, is this showing in full screen?
Could you make the window full screen possibly? There we go.
Okay.
That looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, this talk will be adapted from my master's research presentation, but our original title was An Evaluation of Goat Browsing and Other Restoration Strategies in Buckthorn Invaded Woodlands and Savannas. And just a little bit about my background. Sabrina mentioned some of this, but I'm currently working in Dakota County Park. So we're urban and suburban park system in the Twin Cities metro, extending from West St. Paul to Cannon Falls. We have 6 large county and regional parks that encompass about 6,000 acres. I'm new to the county, but as a county, we've been using goat browsing as a management strategy in a lot of our parks for about 7 years. And currently I'm managing goat browsing contracts at 4 of the parks across about 150 acres. Previous to this job, I was at another nonprofit where I did some other goat browsing contract work as a land manager. And before that, I was getting my master's at the University of Minnesota, doing this research about goat browsing, its effects on buckthorn, its effects on the native plant community, and looking at other strategies that land managers use to deal with their buckthorn. And let's see now. So I'm going to tell you about a little bit of sort of background info about buckthorn and goat browsing. And then I'm going to tell you about 2 studies that I completed as part of my master's research. And then just some tidbits that I've kind of picked up in my professional journey of working with goat browsing contractors and land managers. So just a little bit about buckthorn. This is a shrub or small tree that's from Europe or Eurasia. The Latin name is Rhamnus cathartica. It was introduced to the United States in the 17 or 1800s. And if you've ever walked in a woodland in Minnesota or other parts of the upper Midwest and seen something like this or this, these are examples of what buckthorn can do in understories of forests and even in open areas like some of our prairies and savannas. This kind of wall of green shrubby stuff, that's all common buckthorn in these pictures. And so you can see just visually what an effect it's had in the landscape. This is a map that shows all the blue and pink in this map are the states where buckthorn is present. So it's really kind of its range is kind of in the northern part of the US, upper Midwest, Canada. It seems to have a lot of biological features that help it be so dominant in our understories. It has this extended phenology where it is photosynthesizing earlier and later than a lot of our native plants. It does produce a lot of seed that's eaten and spread by birds. We used to think the seed was viable for a long time, but new research has shown the seeds are actually only viable for a couple of years. But it seems to be allelopathic. It alters the nitrogen cycle of the soil with the way that its leaves decompose. It grows in really low light conditions, so it can outcompete there. And it's just really adaptable to a lot of different conditions in the environment, and perhaps is escaping here in North America from like pests that might eat it in its native range. We also have a lot of systemic drivers that are helping it along. So it seems to really be associated with land conversion, overpopulation of deer. There's some really interesting work by some local scientists about its being a component of an invasional meltdown. So it's associated with all these other invasive species that are kind of co-facilitating each other and sort of making a novel ecosystem here. And it's also seems to be thriving partly due to our catastrophic loss of indigenous land management, and along with that loss of the use of fire in the landscape. There's an interesting concept called mesophication that I'll talk just for a second about, but a lot of our ecosystems in Minnesota and the eastern United States are fire adapted, and a lot of our plant species are adapted to frequent fire. And since fire has been excluded, it gives forest plants and shrubs like buckthorn a chance to come in. Once they're established, they really cool down and make the landscape really moist, and it prevents fire. So it's sort of a feedback loop where it kind of sets the conditions up so that it can thrive, and it excludes our fire adapted ecosystem. So it's a really important concept, I think, for land managers to understand. And I think for me personally, it's a problem basically because of the loss of our biodiversity. But there's also a lot of other economic impacts of buckthorn, pests that it hosts, tick abundance, and just our lack of being able to enjoy native plants and being out in nature. So over the last several decades, people have developed a lot of ways of dealing with buckthorn, trying to eliminate it. Everything from individually cutting each stem of buckthorn with, hand tools to big machines. Lots of different ways of applying herbicide, different ways of cutting it at different times. And these all have their pros and cons. But it's a really pernicious plant. And a lot of the ways of dealing with it inflict some collateral damage, or they are really expensive, or they're really time consuming. And a lot of them also stimulate buckthorn to grow again. It's really good at resprouting after it's been cut. So in no case does it seem like we can just do one treatment and call it good. Like it really regrows really readily. So in the past 5 or 10 years, people have started really turning to this concept of prescribed goat browsing for buckthorn. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm just going to keep an eye on the time. So, and actually, Sabrina, let me know too if we're getting close here. But we have seen a spate of news articles. People get really excited about these goats on the landscape. The concept is that they like eating shrubby stuff, and they have all these advantages. So they're not herbicide-based method. They can get in access little areas that are hard for machines, and people just really like having them around. And they do a really good job of eating the buckthorn in the near term. So you can kind of see like there's this dramatic difference where goats have browsed versus where they haven't. But until some of our recent research, people hadn't really scientifically evaluated if they really are sort of solving these problems of, are they actually killing the buckthorn, or is it just a temporary effect? And also, are they inflicting collateral damage on any native plants that might be in the area? So kind of how does it all add up? What is the cumulative restoration effect of the goats? And another way of saying that is like, are the goats a good tool for getting from this kind of deep, shrubby, dark, bare understory to something biodiverse and healthy? So study number 1 was an experiment where we were asking, okay, 2 things. What is the effect of goat grazing on buckthorn cover, and what is the effect on the plant community? We looked at 8 study sites and sampled right before, right after, and 1 year after goat browsing. And we had this study design where we were sampling at random transects in our goat area and our control area. We did some fancy data analysis, and you can kind of see from these pictures, but we saw the goats definitely defoliated the buckthorn, and then a lot of stuff regrew. What we found is that there was a significant effect on both the buckthorn and the native plants being reduced by the goats right after grazing. But in both cases, they both recovered 1 year later, and there was actually kind of no significant difference either in buckthorn cover or in native plant diversity 1 year later. Here's a graph showing that the blue is our goats. You can kind of see the buckthorn cover recovering, declining, then recovering over the 1 year, and kind of similar with our native plants. We also kept this going for a few more years, and after 3 years of goat grazing, we found the buckthorn was still recovering, and the native plants were still kind of recovering over time as well. And there was some time points when it seemed like either the native plants or the stems of the buckthorn were actually increasing over time. That seemed like it was related to perhaps the light availability opening up. So our conclusion was that goats, at least the way we were deploying them one time per year, were not really a silver bullet. We didn't see any significant changes for buckthorn cover even after 3 years, but they also seemed like they were not harming native plant diversity. The native plants are, deep rooted, and they seem to recover pretty well after the goat browsing. It still kind of left the question of like, is there some way that goats could be part of a solution? And really, like, what is the solution for these areas that are invaded by this shrub? So our other study looked at a lot more sites. We had 53 sites in the study, and we looked at some of those same response variables. So our buckthorn cover, our native species richness, and we looked at all the other things people were doing. So we looked at the use of goats, but also how bad was the buckthorn to begin with? How many years were spent in active restoration? How many things did people try at each of these sites? How long had it been sitting since any management? And who did the restoration work? So was it a contractor, a staff person, a volunteer steward, or some kind of volunteer group? It was really interesting to see there were so many different types of things people were doing to manage buckthorn and restore these areas. And so they did all kinds of cutting of buckthorn, chemical management, but also seeding of native plants, prescribed burning, canopy thinning, and invasive forb removal. So we kind of were trying to quantify that in a metric called management category score. The results of this study were that both our buckthorn and our biodiversity outcomes were predicted by the level of initial invasion of buckthorn. So how bad was it to begin with? And the primary implementer of who did the work. Was it a contractor, or was it a staff person or a site steward? Buckthorn, but not biodiversity outcomes, were predicted by the duration of management. So how long had people been working? How long does it take? And biodiversity, but not buckthorn outcomes, were predicted by the management category score. So how many different things were people trying to make their site recover? So this is an example of, if you had a really invaded site, it didn't recover as easily as a site that was less bad. That's maybe like the site on the right here. This is an interesting graph of our primary implementers and their buckthorn cover at the end of the restoration. So you can see the contractors, so paid professionals, were ending up with much worse buckthorn cover than our steward groups. And mean C is a biodiversity measure, and our stewards and volunteer groups were attaining really excellent results. We found that the duration of management predicted buckthorn outcomes, but not biodiversity outcomes. And all these different measures of biodiversity were predicted by how many different kinds of action. So like the canopy thinning, the addition of species. So just a couple of interesting and surprising things that I think are useful for goat graziers and land managers. So for land managers, the main takeaways are it's really important to consider how badly invaded the site is before you're beginning. And if it's really bad, it's going to take a lot longer to deal with your buckthorn. Our site stewards, I go into in my writing, like why I think the site stewards had such good results. But I think we really need to think about when we're doing restoration work, we need more eyes on the site. We need people to really pay close attention and take care of them on a really frequent basis. And I think we need to think about different ways of doing that. It's important to use a diversity of tactics, especially if you care about restoring biodiversity. So the more kind of nudges you give to the system, it seemed like we were seeing the biodiversity respond. So it's kind of that silver bullet idea, like one thing isn't going to fix the problem. And goats seem like they could be part of the solution, but are not sufficient by themselves. So for graziers, I think what this means is that goats might best be suited for certain actions that are part of like a more comprehensive way of dealing with buckthorn. So maybe they go in first and open up those dense stands and allow for other maintenance to happen inside in the stand or in the woods or in the savanna. They can be part of a regime where you're using them in concert with other methods and using them at certain times of year to eat the foliage that maybe you from buckthorn that you forestry mowed or something like that. And also to open up space for new plants to, like if you do a seeding, get some grass going, then you can get your prescribed fire on the site, something like that. That's one reason not to neglect revegetation. And I think we do need further research into the best ways of deploying them. Would we see different results? Like a lot of goat companies recommend doing multiple browses per year. There's just a lot of different things that could be investigated further. And in Dakota County, so we're still evaluating our goat browsing success. So it does seem like the plants are weakening over the years, and this year the goats are moving through the paddocks really quickly. We don't really know what that means of like, will the buckthorn be killed by the goats eventually, or do we need to do some other management alongside them? We have noticed that there's like a ton of logistics for the grazier, moving the goats rapidly, like when they start getting out, and that really depends on all kinds of environmental factors. We're working with a really great company right now called Diversity Landworks that is tracking their goats with radio collars, and we employ a volunteer force to check on the goats, and frequent text and email communication among all these people who are kind of stakeholders to just have eyes on the goats. And the grazier really needs to be able to respond to goat escapes and other emergencies really rapidly. And just a couple of pictures of some sites in my study that had really recovered well. This one didn't use goats, and this savanna did use goats and had really great results. And here's my thank yous to everyone who helped with the study. So that's what I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
And
Now we will have Dr. Tiffany Wolf present.
Right, let's see. All right, can you see my slides?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. All right. As you might have been able to tell already, Sarah and I were part of the same project, and she did such a great job of introducing the environmental health side of invasive buckthorn. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the animal health implications in regard to how we manage invasive buckthorn. And as Sabrina said in my introduction, I'm a professor of ecosystem health. And so I really like thinking about the interconnectedness between the health of our environment, humans, and animals. And this is such a great issue that embodies some of that. So when it comes to goats and buckthorn, we started thinking about, well, if goats are in the woods and foraging on this invasive plant, what are the health risks associated with that? And one of the important health issues that rose immediately to the top when we started talking about goat owners who were employing their goats for invasive buckthorn control was a parasite known by many as brainworm, scientifically as Paralophus strongylus tenuis, and I'm going to continue to refer to it as P. tenuis from here on out. But this is a parasite that is transmitted by white-tailed deer. It actually doesn't affect white-tailed deer at all. In fact, almost 90% of a white-tailed deer are infected with this parasite. They seem to have co-evolved with it. They can live just fine having this parasite, but they do shed this parasite as larvae into their feces. And once out in the environment, in the feces, an intermediate host will pick that up, gastropods or slugs and snails that are feeding in the environment and across the feces. They'll pick up this larva, and that develops to an infectious form of the parasite. So where deer or our livestock species are then foraging in that environment and inadvertently consume those infected gastropods while they're foraging, they can then become infected. And in livestock, particularly our small ruminants like sheep and goats, but also our camelids like llamas and alpacas, they are very susceptible to developing disease associated with infection by this parasite. We also see other wildlife species suffer from disease caused by this parasite, like elk and moose. These are not normal hosts for this particular parasite. And so what we see when they become infected, they can have clinical signs that range from mild to really severe neurologic disease. And that can be in the form of problems ambulating normally, to a head tilt, changes in responses, normal responses to environmental stimuli, to being unable to walk. When, as a veterinarian, oftentimes the way we're diagnosing infection with this is simply based on the clinical signs. In rare cases, the spinal fluid can be tapped, and we can look at changes in the inflammatory cells that are in that fluid, and that can help us get to a diagnosis. But more often than not, a diagnosis is confirmed after an animal has died or is euthanized, and a pathologist finds that in the central nervous system exam. So more often than not, treatment is often based on clinical signs. So when sheep, goats, camelids present with these clinical signs, there's a suspicion of P. tenuis, veterinarians will come in with combined anti-parasitics and anti-inflammatories. This doesn't always reverse the clinical signs, but it can stop the progression of the clinical signs. So it's not a great disease to have if you're a sheep or a goat. And one of the big concerns is if we're putting goats into the woods where we often find our white-tailed deer to browse on buckthorn, what are the chances that they're going to come across infected snails with P. tenuis and succumb to disease? Is that risk higher than if they're normally being managed in a typical livestock pasture environment? And so we started looking at the epidemiology. What do we know about P. tenuis in small ruminants? An important risk factor is that, again, as I mentioned already, if these livestock are overlapping or sharing habitat with deer, this increases their chances of getting infected, especially if they're sharing habitat during the spring, which is a time of year when deer are shedding higher numbers of these larvae in their feces. The environmental risk factors that we are aware of that have been suggested to put animals at risk of P. tenuis transmission from gastropods include increased moisture and increased temperature. And those are both factors that are associated with increased gastropod activity on the landscape. We also looked at trying to understand if there was changes in the risk of transmission by season or even by year. Anecdotally, we're hearing from goat owners that some years are just really bad years for P. tenuis infection in goats. And what we found in the literature is those anecdotes are there too, but there wasn't a lot of good scientific research to back that up. And so, let's see. So we decided to really look at the ways that we could answer this question to better understand the patterns of P. tenuis among susceptible livestock species in Minnesota. And lucky us, in the vet school, we have our very own veterinary diagnostic laboratory that provides diagnostic services for livestock owners around Minnesota and the region. And so we tapped into their database to look at their necropsy records, to look at their pathology reports. So for all camelids and small ruminants that had been submitted to the diagnostic lab for a necropsy or a postmortem exam from 2001 to 2019. And we examined across all of those records to determine how many of them were diagnosed with P. tenuis infection on mortality, and what did that look like, when was that occurring? And so over those 19 years, we looked at over 5,600 cases of llamas, alpacas, sheep, and goats that were submitted to the Minnesota VDL for necropsy. And among those, there were 64 cases of P. tenuis infection that gave us an overall mortality rate of 1.1%. We saw a higher proportion of P. tenuis infection among llamas and alpacas as compared to sheep and goats. And that matched available information in the literature on species susceptibility. Of course, there's other factors that might explain these differences beyond just species susceptibility. That could be things like possible differences in the likelihood that each species was even submitted for necropsy, as well as differences in how they're managed or their foraging patterns on the landscape. So here, in this figure, we're looking at the proportion of cases that were submitted to the VDL that were diagnosed with P. tenuis across all species. So these data represent the number of positive P. tenuis necropsy cases out of the total number of necropsy cases for all of the species examined over this time period. And this is by month, time of year. And these patterns make some sense. So we saw the lowest case numbers occurring in late winter into early spring. This is a time of year when we wouldn't expect P. tenuis transmission to be happening because gastropods are not active on the landscape during that time of year in Minnesota. But we also saw, and as you can see here, a peak in cases in the late winter and into the early spring. And what that tells us, we know from the literature that the incubation period in small ruminants ranges from 30 to 60 days. And so these patterns are suggesting that these animals were likely getting exposed either in late summer and into the fall for us to be seeing mortalities during the wintertime. Now, in this figure, now we're looking at the changes in P. tenuis induced mortality over all years of study. So again, we're asking the question, what's the annual variation in P. tenuis cases? And the big takeaway from this figure is that over these 19 years, we observed a steady, slow increase in P. tenuis over time in these cases in Minnesota. So the last thing that we did was to model the seasonal effects of temperature and precipitation on the probability of P. tenuis mortality in these small ruminants and camelids. And as I mentioned, these are two environmental risk factors that have been suggested to be really important to P. tenuis infection. And the bottom line is, and we ran several different models looking at precipitation and temperature at different times of the year. And the important takeaway is, an interesting takeaway is, we found that of all of these models, summer temperature was positively associated with risk of mortality. And so, in other words, as summertime temperatures increased, the probability of P. tenuis mortality also increased. We didn't see any association with precipitation, which was surprising because we know that precipitation can increase gastropod activity on the landscape. We theorized that the temperature association may be related to the fact that one, we know as temperature increases, that can increase the development time of P. tenuis in the intermediate host. So they can become infectious to livestock and deer much more rapidly during these higher temperatures. Alternatively, this relationship may be associated with the fact that livestock management may certainly be changed or influenced by summer temperatures. So we don't know the underlying mechanism, but that was certainly something interesting finding. And this certainly has implications for climate change. So if we're seeing positive associations between summer temperatures and P. tenuis induced mortality, as well as increases in P. tenuis induced mortalities over time, we know that summertime temperatures in Minnesota have increased by 1 degree Celsius over the time span of 1951 to 2012. And they're only expected to increase in the future. And so we would expect, based on this combination of results, that we might also expect the risk of P. tenuis transmission to increase in our domestic livestock species that are susceptible. So back to invasive plant control. Ideally what we really wanted to do was test goats and determine if they're out on a pasture versus if they're in the woods, what's the likelihood of them becoming exposed to P. tenuis. Sadly, we don't have a test that can help us to do that. And so one of the things that we asked was whether we could identify a way to avoid or prevent exposure to the infected gastropods while goats are browsing in the woods. And our postdoc, Katie Marchetto, had this brilliant idea of, well, what if we co-graze goats with waterfowl, which are known to graze on gastropods themselves. And so our question was really quite simple. Can we, if we co-graze goats and waterfowl, can we reduce the transmission of P. tenuis through the gastropod host? And the way we could do that was by measuring changes in the gastropod community. And so we set up this experimental design where we had an area where there were no goats and no waterfowl. We had another area where we just grazed goats, and a third area where we grazed goats and waterfowl together. And we set up this experiment in 2 years, in the fall, over 2 years. And we collected gastropods at, I say we, our postdoc Katie did all the collections, as well as the identification of the gastropod species she was collecting. We collected them before we put animals on the landscape, and we collected them again at the end of that period when they were grazing. And what we found was that we found 17 species of terrestrial gastropods during this sampling period. 5 of these species were known P. tenuis intermediate hosts, and there were 2 additional species, Cochleocopa lubricella and Strobolops aeneas, that were considered potential hosts for P. tenuis. So we had a total of 971 individuals collected during these experiments, of which 16% were known intermediate hosts, increasing to 31% if we considered C. lubricella and S. aeneas as intermediate hosts as well. This figure, or these figures, we're looking at, and they're a little bit complex, but we're looking at the change in the gastropod community from the beginning of the experiment to the end of the experiment. And we use 3 different metrics to measure that change: abundance, richness, and diversity. And I think the 2 key things I want you to take away from these figures is, one, we saw some very mixed results when we looked across these, depending on what metric we used to assess how that gastropod community changed. But the consistent thing that we saw was that when you put goats on the landscape, end result is that gastropod community increases in abundance, richness, and diversity. And we think that was because as they're defecating in the environment, they are attracting gastropods to the area. That's a hypothesis. But what was really interesting when we really focus in on those species that are known P. tenuis hosts and how those species were impacted by these experiments. Again, we see this increase, and the green, I should have said this earlier, the green color represents the goats only treatment. The blue represents our goats and waterfowl treatment, and the pink is control, so no animals there. Again, we saw increase in the abundance of P. tenuis, known P. tenuis hosts. But when we added the waterfowl, we didn't see that same increase. In fact, we saw a drop in the gastropod community, or at least in the gastropods that are known P. tenuis hosts in that community. So that was a really promising. Those are the gastropods we want to impact anyway. So going back to these ecosystem health implications, which is what I really like to think about, we saw that when we co-graze goats and with waterfowl, it appears to mitigate that increase in the intermediate hosts, those gastropod intermediate hosts that occurs when we browse goats just by themselves in that deciduous forest environment. Co-grazing waterfowl with goats didn't actually affect the overall gastropod abundance, richness, or diversity, which is a good thing if you think gastropods are an important part of ecosystem health. And what I didn't mention in here is that when we looked at invasive gastropods, the primary one being a species Daraceras reticulatum is also an important intermediate host of P. tenuis. Those were also reduced. So we're reducing invasive gastropod species as well when we add in waterfowl while grazing goats. Importantly, neither the use of goats for invasive plant control nor the co-grazing of waterfowl to mitigate P. tenuis risk really had any kind of detrimental effects on the gastropod community. And so again, if we're thinking about gastropods as being an important part of overall ecosystem health, we didn't really impact that co-grazing waterfowl. Now, I must say, given the recent events related to the transmission of avian influenza to some of our livestock, our domestic livestock, recommendations for browsing waterfowl and goats together, especially during the seasonal transmission of avian influenza, may not be a very good idea, because we know that waterfowl in particular can harbor avian influenza and not be affected by them. And so that's something to think about when making these kinds of decisions as well. And I'll finish by acknowledging the many people who were involved in this and our funders. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Wonderful. Now we can have Dr. Mike Schuster.
I'm back here. All right. There we go. You have the right screen, I'm assuming.
Yep.
Great. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks everybody for joining me tonight. Yeah, I'm a researcher in the Department of Forest Resources. I'm a plant guy, not a goat guy explicitly, but if we're talking about managing buckthorn, there's this big elephant or maybe goat in the room that we have to deal with, and that is actually making any type of management stick, because that's the perennial issue with buckthorn management is over and over and over again we end up in a situation where we're right back where we started, or maybe even in a worse spot. So my work looks at using plants to kind of interrupt this cycle and help control buckthorn. right? And so there's lots of different ways that we can go about removing buckthorn. And again, notice the quotation marks, whether that's a mechanical method like hand cutting or even using large machinery like this forestry mower on the upper left here. Goats can be part of that thing. Certainly it's something that people are doing. And I think the work that Tiffany and Sarah described earlier is a fantastic advancement on what we understand about the utility and limitations of goats. In more open environments, we can use fire, and then of course we can use herbicides as well. And so these are all, tools in the toolbox that we have for dealing with buckthorn. But whatever it is that we do, they're almost always incomplete. And the reason for that is because buckthorn tends to persist. It endures regardless of these management approaches through three different mechanisms. One is that buckthorn, when damaged, will resprout from the base of the stem. And so when you go in and cut buckthorn or mulch it or mow it or whatever, it tends to regrow, right? And it will grow, it will transition from being a plant that's basically one stem into a plant that is many stems. So it's like a hydra from Greek mythology, where you slice off one head and you get 10 more in its place. That's buckthorn in a nutshell. But we also have ongoing pressures from small buckthorn that escape treatment, either as a product of the management approach, right? Like if we go out and say, we're only going to cut things that are 3 feet or taller. Well, we're ignoring all those little buckthorn. Or maybe there are things that are just missed, right? By accident, whether that's a person going through with a herbicide backpack, or goats just not munching on something that they seem to miss. And then there are new buckthorn that come in from seed dispersal. And all of these three mechanisms mean that buckthorn comes back very quickly and very strongly after any of these management approaches. And so we get situations like this. This is a site where a forestry mower went through, and then 2 years later, the site looks like this. Everything that you see here, all that green, is primarily buckthorn. And you can see, for scale, I have my collaborator, Peter Ragg, here, and a couple interns. This buckthorn is taller than them. It's larger than they are. And that's the amount of regrowth we get in a lot of these systems. So it's a really big deal. Those resprouts are an immediate challenge that has to be dealt with in any buckthorn management scenario. And if they're not dealt with, they'll quickly reclaim dominance of the system. They'll take over again, bigger and stronger than they were before. Again, as an illustration, I'm about 6 feet tall. I'm a little taller than 6 feet, and this is a resprout at a site down in Victoria, Minnesota, that is just as tall as I am months after being cut. Now, it was one of these giant buckthorns, like the really old ones that we call like a mother of all buckthorn, a Moab. And so it had tons of stored reserves, tons of carbohydrates it could use to make this growth, but it still illustrates that's an incredible amount of growth potential that has to be dealt with. And so we have to be real serious about dealing with that. And there's potentially multiple ways that you can do that. Of course, you can use herbicides, particularly triclopyr-based products are kind of the go-to for that. One of the lesser used herbicides that we've explored that we found to be really effective is something called phosamine. So both of those are reliable herbicides that can target woody species in particular. And then if you're not interested in using herbicides, you can do repeated mechanical removal. And there's growing evidence to suggest that consistently removing biomass from buckthorn can be an effective way to wear it down. But it's not like a once a year thing. It's a multiple times a year thing where you're going through and really sticking on it. And of course, that's going to be dependent on the size of the plant and the growth conditions and all that stuff. But repeated mechanical removal can be a way of dealing with these resprouts. And so let's say that we've dealt with those resprouts, or at least put in the old goat herder try, and we've more or less reduce them to be a minor component of the system. That leaves these other two mechanisms, these other two pressures that we have to deal with, the small buckthorn and the new buckthorn. And the thing about those is that we've actually kind of made life a lot easier for them through all these other management approaches that we're doing. Little buckthorn like that, the small buckthorn, really are being suppressed by their big brothers and sisters around them. This is a graph down here from a study that we did a few years ago at this point, looking at buckthorn survival relative to light availability, relative to canopy openness. And you'll see that on the x-axis here, we have canopy openness. Once you get below 10% here, that's really when we start to see buckthorn survival start to dip down, and you really have to get below 4, 3, 2, 1% to actually see meaningful reductions in buckthorn survival. And that's important because if you look at this picture above it, you know, we have an area here on the left where we have buckthorn intact, and an area on the right where it's been largely removed through a cut and treat approach. And the light environment between these two places, the left and the right of this image, are very different. Right? On the left, there's very little light, and on the right, there's way, way, way more light. And so in a lot of cases, we move systems from a place where little buckthorn are being suppressed, they have really low survival rates, into an area where they are living their best life. They are spoiled for light. They have very high survival rates, very high growth rates. And so the act of removing those larger buckthorns actually releases those small buckthorn from their suppressive effects and gives them a whole bunch of resources that they can use to grow bigger faster. And so the question that I work with is, how can we interrupt that? How can we beat the buckthorn to the punch and soak up all those resources, soak up that light using native species instead of letting the buckthorn take it all for themselves? And so we did this experiment at 7 different sites around the Twin Cities metro of Minnesota, ranging in light availability as well as many other different aspects of their communities. And we looked at comparisons between areas where we did some initial management, we did some foliar spray to take care of the resprouts, and then we went ahead and seeded or didn't seed areas. And the places that we seeded, we put in a mixture of 11 different grass species. Really the ones you want to pay attention to are the wild rice species. We put in 22 wildflower species like snakeroot or brown-eyed Susan or giant hyssop. And then we had a couple sedge species in there as well, but the sedges really didn't show up very well, so you can kind of just forget about them. And what we found was that in areas that we seeded, we had accumulating impacts of seeding over time. So this is a graph showing the mass, the size of the buckthorn that we had growing in these environments relative to their age, so how old they were in years. And the different colored bars correspond to different cohorts, different years of dispersal, different years of germination of buckthorn seedlings. And what you see comparing the open bars to the closed bars of each different color is that as you move from left to right in this graph, the difference between the size of buckthorn grown in unseeded areas and buckthorn grown in seeded areas gets bigger. There's a larger difference between buckthorn growing in an unseeded area and those growing in a seeded area. And that difference is greatest for those buckthorn that are arriving early on in the experiment. In other words, those buckthorns that show up early after initial management. So the ones showing up the year after or the year after that, after we've done some sort of buckthorn removal. And the magnitude of this effect is pretty large. 65% reduction in buckthorn biomass in the 2018 cohort, 77% reduction in the 2019 cohort. So that's a year or two after initial management. That's a pretty massive reduction in the size of buckthorn returning after management, just because we've reintroduced some competitive species into the community. And when we look at this in a little bit more detail, we see that this is a context-dependent response, that the amount of suppression that we get is dependent in particular on how much light is coming through the overstory canopy, right? Coming through the canopy, the oaks, the maples, how much light is being let down to the ground layer. And what we see is that we get the most effective seeding in higher light environments. So places where the canopy is more open. This is a graph showing that we get more herbaceous cover based on the y-axis over that canopy openness on the x-axis. And that means that we have greater reductions in total light availability in those higher canopy openness settings. So it's a little counterintuitive, right? You would think that maybe if the canopy was more open, there'd be more light available to the buckthorn. But instead, what we see is that when you seed in a more open environment, those seeded species compensate for that added light availability, and they soak up more of that light, meaning that there's less light available to these little baby buckthorn when they show up. So seeding is more effective in those high light environments, particularly things more than 10% canopy openness. What does that look like? Well, here is a hemispherical photo of a 20% open canopy. And in the middle here, we have a graph showing that that mass estimate relative to canopy openness. And we see that reductions in buckthorn mass grow as we are seeding into more and more open environments. So at a 20% open canopy, we have about a 90% reduction in buckthorn biomass. That's greater than the average. Whereas at something like a 7% canopy openness, we only have a 60% reduction in buckthorn biomass. So again, these are both very meaningful reductions, but they vary depending on the context. They're going to be more effective in those brighter environments. And so the takeaway here is that establishing native plants immediately after initial removal can reduce invasion in the following years. And we're talking about buckthorn here, but this is a broadly applicable concept that if there's not enough light for buckthorn to persist, there's probably not going to be enough light for a lot of invasive species to come in. And so this has kind of cascading benefits to overall ecosystem structure and function. And as that happens, as we reduce the amount of buckthorn that's coming back, we have to do less, right? That means less time out in the field. That means less herbicide we have to use. That means less money. That means more opportunities to do other things. And it means more value of our forests to us and to wildlife. There's other benefits too. So by seeding, we are increasing the amount of fuel that's available in these understories. One of the really common side effects of buckthorn invasion is that there's just no fuel for fire. And so we can't use fire as a management tool in buckthorn invaded forests because there's nothing to burn. That's different than in grasslands or savannas, but in forests, there's just not enough fuel. And so by revegetating, we're actually increasing the amount of fuel and able to use fire as a management tool in places where maybe it wouldn't otherwise be practical. And so seeding helps improve burn spread and severity. And so grass seeding in particular can facilitate more effective management of remaining buckthorn. It allows us to do things like burning, but it also makes the remaining buckthorn smaller and weaker, more vulnerable to any of those management approaches we're taking. Another benefit is for pollinators, right? When we're including things like that bee balm or giant hyssop in our seed mixes, we're able to actually, improve habitat for really important species like the rusty patch bumblebee, which is one of Minnesota's newest endangered species. So not only can we improve plant biodiversity, reduce invasion, but we can also support some of these pollinator species as well. And so taking a step back, wrapping it all up, I want to point out that this illustrates that the approach as a whole can be effective. Our work has looked at only a small subset of species out of all the possible ones that you could look at, but is very promising. It shows that it can work, especially in those more open environments. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't look at other species. There's likely other things that work too that we just haven't looked at yet. So, what has traits that are similar to the ones that worked for us? What are species that meet your other management goals and are appropriate for your site history? Those are things that are worth considering and exploring as well. And so, in a nutshell, establishing native species quickly after some sort of initial management can reduce the amount of buckthorn that's coming back over multiple years. We've been doing this since 2016, 2017, and we've seen a consistent response both locally here in the Twin Cities, but also through our citizen science network across the state. So it's a broadly applicable approach. Seeding wild ryegrasses, those Alimus species, can slow the growth of existing small buckthorn and new buckthorn as well. And then this isn't something that we really got into, but if you're in a darker site where you can't get wildflowers or grasses to grow, things like red elderberry, Sambucus racemosa, or planting trees like sugar maple or balsam fir that hold their leaves late into the fall or evergreen, those can also have a very similar effect, if not stronger. They're just harder to implement because you're planting trees instead of throwing seed around in the forest. So if you're curious about this though, if you want to know more about species lists, details about what we've done, we have a website, coveredup.umn.edu, that has all of our information on it. Of course, you can also email me. My email address is schuster@umn.edu. Pretty simple. And yeah, again, thank you. We have a bunch of partners that have made this work possible, and they deserve a tip of the hat as well. So thanks.
Outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Schuster. Appreciate it. We've got great participation from our audience and attendees, and so I'm going to ask Sarah and Tiffany and Michael to join us back, and we'll attack these. These have been in the chat box, and so those of you that got to take some time off in between got to get a little bit of a heads up for some of these, but we'll kind of dig through some of the questions. And so I think it's a fun one to kind of start out with is, what about the impact of multiple passes through an area within a year for multiple years? And so I think a big discussion in how those goat owners decide to manage or attack the invasive buckthorn, if that was the case. And so what are your thoughts on kind of, do we need to dig through it again, twice? Just reiterate your thoughts there, if you kindly will.
Sure, I can take that one. I think that is a really good theory of a good way to use goats if it's available to you, especially if you have your own goats. Might as well keep putting them back out there. I think the theory is that they're depleting the plant's energy and stored in the roots every time they hit them. So I think we're kind of lacking in science for this, but intuitively that makes a lot of sense to me.
Outstanding. And so one of the things I think that's important to keep into consideration is maybe the number or amount. And we think of this when we had a grazing presentation that was a month ago, just obviously focused more at forages in comparison to the browsing. But I think one of those numbers, or one of those questions that we commonly ask, is the number. And so maybe some people only have a small number of animals to attack the situation with. And some of those, if we were to ask for, goats as a pure management standpoint of saying, let's go get this, let's accomplish it. What's kind of the strengths and weaknesses, the limitations of, having 10 goats, 50 goats, 200 goats, as we think about it from a number standpoint? I'm going to let you have that start with that one again, Sarah.
Okay, sure. So that was something we wanted to look at in our study, and it just got too complex because we were using different herds and stuff. But one thing we noticed, and there's in other grazing sciences, there's like a lot of studies looking at the animal units and the density of the herds. For us, we were moving the goats on after the buckthorn was well defoliated, which can happen with just a few goats and it takes them a long time. or it can happen with, you know, a large herd of goats in a small area and it takes them a couple days. The impacts of the large herd is definitely going to differ. So I think that's an area where looking at the impacts on the understory plants is a consideration. Like I think the trampling large herd is harder on those understory species. I'm not sure what the difference is on the buckthorn itself, like if it's slowly defoliated or quickly defoliated. I'm not sure if that matters so much. But like things like erosion and just the level of bare ground that you get with a big herd that's sticking around maybe at their favorite spots or something, that can be a big impact on a site.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Wolf, the next ones you saw were pointed at you, and so I'm going to pass the baton, right? And so a couple of these that I think kind of fit in nicely. And so does the increase of P. tenuis mortality over the years differ among different species? And then the second portion or a part of that is there an impact on the deer population estimates with the infection?
Yeah, such great questions. I'll start with the second one first. We didn't measure deer density in our study, but we know from previous studies in the literature that deer density is correlated with P. tenuis mortality in susceptible hosts. So the more deer that are on the landscape sharing habitat, the higher the prevalence of P. tenuis, both actually in the gastropods themselves, as well as our aberrant hosts like our livestock species or our moose, for example. So we know that relationship exists from previous studies that have been conducted. In regard to the first question, unfortunately, although that was certainly an interest of ours, we didn't have enough data to answer that question. We only ended up seeing 64 cases of P. tenuis in 19 years across all of those livestock species. And so there just wasn't, and when you think about the goats and the sheep, those were exceptionally low prevalence levels. So very, very few cases. We really weren't able to, we didn't have enough data to look at how those rates increased in the individual species, which was why we looked at overall transmission rates or mortality rates, I should say. Great questions, though.
Outstanding. Thank you. All right, Dr. Schuster, you're well aware as you look at the question bank, it's tag you're it, okay? And so we've got a couple here actually from our same attendee on biodiversity impact of planting extensive Virginia rye. And then also, I think you can be able to cover in a similar type spot of the methods and timing that you would use on the hilly or rocky woodlands of when would we put in the seeding? Would it be in the spring or would we do that while it was dormant? So I'll let you attack those.
Yeah, so well, good questions. So as far as the biodiversity impacts of seeding a lot of Virginia wild rye, in our approach, we included that very grass heavy mixture, but we also included a lot of native wildflowers as well. And so when you compare the biodiversity of plant species in years 1, 2, or 3, you tend not to actually see a very large difference in the biodiversity between seeded and unseeded areas. What you see is a replacement of more weedy species like your goldenrods, for example, with the grass species in particular. But once you get past year 3, year 4, then you start to see a change. And the important part to remember there is that, or to know, is that the grass species, the wild rye grass species, are not particularly enduring. They will persist for 5 years, and then basically, exist in a much lower density than they did before. And that opens up the opportunity for these wildflower species we seeded in simultaneously to really take off. And so, early on, you might not see a difference in the total diversity, but the composition is different. Once you get to these later stages, you see changes in composition and improved biodiversity, because we have, these things like Virginia waterleaf or red columbine showing up that otherwise wouldn't be present on the site. And so, so yes, immediately there might not be very high biodiversity because of the emphasis on grasses, but it's not persistent. It opens the door, it pushes the system in a way that can transition into a more biodiverse native system than would be possible otherwise. As far as when we do seeding, that's also related to the composition of the seed mix. In general, forb species, wildflower species, are more likely to need some pre-treatment. They need to go through a winter or two in order to germinate. And so we, for that reason, we seed those species in the winter on the snow. We seed on top of the snow. And that has a couple advantages. One is it exposes those wildflowers to those cold temperatures that they need, but it also allows you to more easily see like where you threw the seeds and ensure a better coverage. It also has some good benefits for germination in terms of like when the snow melts, it gives you good seed soil contact and moisture and all that. So that's generally how we do it. If you're just doing grasses, though, you can wait. You can wait to do more of an early spring seeding and have good germination that way, because the grasses don't require that pre-treatment.
Thank you. Dr. Tiffany, so would gastropods be less of a problem or P. tenuis less of a problem in the urban areas where there are a lot fewer population of a deer species?
I think it's safe to say where there are fewer deer, there's going to be fewer infected gastropods, and there's going to be lower risk to goats. I caution also, though, deer are really successful in our peri-urban areas and suburban areas where we still have some great forest cover for them to use. So yeah, I hear all the time from my colleagues about the deer munching on their garden plants. So I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't say the risk is not there, but yes, where there are fewer deer, there should be less risk.
Outstanding. We're going just a smidge outside the box, or at least past my talent level, and that's why we got great individuals here. All right. And so one comes up as, has any work been done looking at combining pig rooting after the goats?
Not to my knowledge. But I'd be curious to think about what would be if the goats come through and eat the leaves, then the pigs root up the buckthorn. Totally worth trying, I think. And I would just say too, like I was really excited to hear Mike's work about the light, because I think this is another example of like these things can be done in combination. So you have your goats come through and eat the leaves, have your pigs come through and root up your buckthorn, get some seed down right away to start pushing your understory towards native plants, and maybe also open up your canopy to give the light a chance to feed those native plants. The more nudges that we're doing is it all adds up together.
Outstanding. Okay, so we've got some a couple good things that I think can kind of tie a lot of this together. And so a couple different things. And so the one of them is the advice for the herbicide averse landowner or manager. And truthfully, that's Dr. Schuster, that's my last question. All right, because you guys talked and showed everything that we have for options. So I'm going to pass just a second. You saw on that one, but there's also, we have an international audience as well. So individuals that are to the border of the north from us, from the Ontario-Quebec border, said, what types of competitive plant species would you recommend if not the ones that you used? Okay. And then also said, is there an impact on carbon capture with the increasing number of indigenous species? So Dr. Schuster, that gets pointed at you first, and then we'll kind of pull things together here at the end of just identifying our options to kind of tie it all together.
Yeah, so another great set of questions. So as far as the carbon capture goes, I don't have measurements on that here specifically, but we do know that biodiversity is generally associated with productivity, and we would often expect that this would be a better system for carbon capture compared to a kind of an ambient passive restoration approach. So I don't know, but I would hope that maybe there would be benefits here as far as that goes. As far as species to use further north, it really would depend on your particular environmental context. If you're a little bit more towards the grassy portions, or if you're more in the boreal portions or more temperate portions. But species, any grass species that you can get in there quickly is going to be advantageous for that short turnaround time that was essential for our results. So maybe things like switchgrass, if that's appropriate for your ecotype. But if you're looking at forb species, wildflower species, things like different types of asters, like large leaf aster is something that comes to mind in particular, or even getting those shrubs like red elderberry established. Red elderberry is a fantastic plant for lots of different reasons, but one of them is because it has a really wide range in North America. So it goes pretty far south and pretty far north, and would be appropriate for your habitat most likely. It's just you'd have to put the effort into establishing it at the appropriate density.
All right, thank you. Well, here's one that punched in there. How shade tolerant is red elderberry? I find it in the forest edges.
Yeah, so it's moderately shade tolerant. It's not going to grow, it's not going to grow under sugar maple, for example. But in most places that we find buckthorn to be the biggest problems, particularly in those oak woodlands or potentially floodplains, mixed mesic forests, it will grow sufficiently well in those places if, and this is the big giant asterisk, it's not browsed by deer, right? So if you can protect it from deer, it will have a fairly good growth rate. It will be better when there's more light, but it can still tolerate those moderate shade conditions.
Okay, this is my summary question, and then Sabrina is going to take the charge again and give the shout out to our team that has helped to facilitate us with the Sustainable Farming Association as well. But the last one I think is pretty overarching, but just a great summarization because it says, what can we do for those that are herbicide averse? And that's why we're doing what we're doing, right? That's why we're hosting this webinar, is so that it's not all chemically treated or truthfully mechanically treated. And as Dr. Schuster said there, at least from plant species, we can help to have some remedial improvements at the end of it. And so I'm going to pass it in the order that we presented our information today, of just your quick follow-up thoughts of how do we dig in? Okay, this is managing buckthorn, and what are your quick takeaways? And Sarah, you get to lead the charge, followed by Tiffany, and then Dr. Schuster as well.
Specifically about not using herbicide?
Yep. So we chose goats, right, to manage our buckthorn and kind of see what other options there are. But what's your quick takeaway for this evening's webinar?
Sure. So I think that goats, they're not, as we said, they're not a silver bullet. You can't put goats out one time and have solved your buckthorn problem. They're a good component potentially for doing some of these other techniques we talked about. I also think a cool thing to think about with respect to the herbicide question is there's a technique called critical cutting that we've been starting to hear about here in Minnesota. If you cut the buckthorn kind of high, it resprouts from the cut, and you can kill it over a couple seasons by pulling off the resprouts. I think goats, we should try using goats to eat those resprouts. If anybody does it, I'd love to hear about it.
And I would just say, you know, thinking about the animal health side of this issue, if you're planning to utilize goats and really any invasive species control in a forested environment, just think about some of those health risks based on what can be transmitted from the other species that are there, and the most important being P. tenuis transmission from deer. Being able to recognize the clinical signs and some of our thinking about some of our work, understanding what the risks are, those warmer summers, and what the opportunities might be in regard to the potential for co-grazing with waterfowl to reduce that exposure risk, may be a really unique approach to managing that situation.
Yeah, so I was actually I'm happy that Sarah mentioned the critical cutting thing, because that was gonna be what I was gonna say. So we actually have an experiment that that we're doing right now, looking at that. And so Sarah, maybe we should chat about that at some other time. But yeah, the idea of just continually removing biomass is one way that theoretically, you should be able to kill buckthorn, and there's anecdotal evidence to suggest that that can be effective. The challenge, of course, is scaling that up. It's relatively trivial to cut down 5 buckthorn trees and strip them. It's a totally different issue to cut down 5,000 buckthorn trees and routinely strip them. And so that is one of the ways that perhaps goats are the answer, is because you don't have to deal with them the same way you have to deal with human laborers. So, but yeah, as far as non-chemical treatments go, that's one of the things that I think about. The issue with revegetation is that it's also not a silver bullet, and it doesn't deal with those resprouts, right? So like we have to deal with those resprouts in order for the revegetation to kind of take over and hold back those more long-term persistent pressures of the seed bank and those little buckthorn. And so that's something to be aware of, is that you do have to pair it with those other management tools to take care of the resprouts.
Outstanding. I'd like to thank our talented trio of panelists. I'm going to pass it back to Sabrina. We do have a July 10th webinar planned for a lamb market outlook. And so if individuals are willing to join us on July 10. But Sabrina, will you introduce our talented colleagues and let them know what we got going on up next?
Yes, thank you three for sharing your expertise with us again. And if you are interested still in learning more about buckthorn control or seeing it happening out in the field, we have Tyler Carlson from the Sustainable Farming Association, as well as Brad Gordon, who's with Great River Greening, and they have been planning some field days for the summer. So if Tyler or Brad want to pop on and share a few more details about that.
Yeah, hi there. I hope my video feed's gonna make this work here. I can turn it off if it's not working. But yeah, thank you to the extension team and the researchers for bringing us all together today. This has been fantastic to have all this research in one place and for everyone to take a look at, and to have the recording to share out with our communities. And yeah, it's perfect timing because we have a field day coming up on June 24th from 4 to 7 p.m. at the Lebanon Hills Regional Park. So SFA and our partners with Great River Greening and some researchers at the U of M, we're in our phase 2 of restoring oak savannas and oak woodlands using silvopasture. And we're going to be looking at the work that the park staff there and their partners with Diversity Landworks have been doing with goats and underseedings and fire to restore oak savanna there. And we'll start the day with a fencing demonstration, looking at portable fencing and water systems for these kinds of treatments. See the tools, learn the tips and tricks of the trade for how to use electric net in woody, brushy sites. It's kind of a mess. So we'll learn from the experts on that. And like I said, we'll talk about some understory seedings and prescribed fire and kind of bring all this stuff that we learned here today out there into the field. And there will be food provided. There will be a meal for the evening. And later in the summer, so I provided a link for that in the chat. And then later in the summer, we're going to have a permanent fencing demonstration workshop. So a training workshop, it'll be a full day. There'll be limited registration for that. That's also up on SFA's website. And then we'll also have another workshop, field day workshop and demonstration out at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge later in the summer, looking at some other goat and also some cattle, high impact, high density grazing on hazelnut to try to move those systems back to a more herbaceous understory in oak savanna. So those dates and times are to be determined, but you can watch SFA and like SUSTAG for those when they come out and when we have those pretty soon. And I'm also going to share SFA has a Facebook group called the Silvopasture Learning Network. And you can find that there at that link and join that to stay connected and just kind of join in the conversation with the community. Thanks all.
I think that's all we have for you. Thank you, Tyler, for sharing those field days with us, and Tiffany, Sarah, and Mike for sharing your expertise and knowledge and the ins and outs of buckthorn management, and of course, Travis for leading the charge and keeping us all on track.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.